I've been asked to kind of wrap up and talk about the road ahead. Now, I think any time someone's putting together a program and they know they're going to have an economist on board, they think, well, economists, they make forecasts, so we'll let him talk about the future. Well, it is true that economists make forecasts. We're good at making forecasts. It's making accurate forecasts that we have difficulty with. In fact, most economists can't even predict accurately, can't even predict the past. And all you have to do to recognize that is look at what we're saying about the 80s. A lot of economists are saying that the 80s were a horrible decade. Well, I say that means you can't even predict the past if you think the 80s were a horrible decade. Now, I'm not down on economic forecasting. I think there's some good that comes out of economic forecasting. It has served to make astrology look respectable. And now, I do want to point out that my boss, Al Nemai, the dean of the business school, is an economic forecast. And so I quickly want to point out that nothing I've said about economic forecasting applies to Al Nemai. Al Nemai's forecast, they're always accurate, they're to the point, they're insightful, they're right on the money, and I would tell him that to his face. Well, so far, the discussion has been on taxes and spending at the state level, primarily the state of Georgia. But what I want to do is shift emphasis a little bit by arguing that we're really not going to be able to get a real grasp on what's happening at the state level, state spending and state taxes, unless we consider rather fully the fiscal relationship that exists between the states and the federal government. There's one fundamental fact, and I think this has been pointed out. I want to emphasize it before I get into this relationship between the states and the federal government, and that is that if you're interested in the long-run growth of the state economy, the best thing you can do is keep taxes as low as possible. Keep the tax burden as low as possible. If you're interested in the long run, if you're interested in economic growth, if you're interested in efficiency, keep those tax rates down. There's a lot of evidence in support of this proposition. Economists in Ohio by the name of Rich Vedder and Lowell Galloway have done a lot of studies on this, and the studies are unequivocal. Unfortunately, however, this relationship that the states have with the federal government, the fiscal relationship, works against this type of responsibility and farsightedness. It makes it very difficult for local politicians to take the long view when considering tax policy. The overriding feature of the fiscal relationship between the state and the federal governments is that much of the tax base of the states has effectively been taken over by the federal government. And much of the tax base in every state in the union goes to generate revenue that goes directly to Washington. Then the states have to plead and struggle to get some of that revenue back. That's a fundamental feature of the relationship between the state and the federal government as far as taxes. The federal government takes most of the revenue, ships it to Washington. The states have to beg and plead to get it back. And this creates a situation where it's almost impossible for state politicians to act responsibly. Even if state politicians wanted to act responsibly, even if they wanted to keep tax rates low, even if they wanted to confine themselves to just essential spending, even if they wanted to do that essential spending as efficiently as possible, at least cost, they would be seen as foolish if they did it. And indeed, they might be foolish if they did that. Because once our money has been sent to Washington, we want our representatives to get as much of it back as possible right here in the state. We want them to go to Washington or send their lobbyists to Washington and get as much of it back. Because we know that if we don't get our money back, that doesn't mean the federal government's going to say, well, Georgia didn't get much money back, so we'll quit taking money away from Georgia. If we don't get it back, we're going to still be sending just as much to Georgia. It's just that somebody else is going to get our money. And so any cockamamie project that is going to look good to state politicians, if it appeals to federal officials and can be used to capture or recapture federal dollars, get some of those dollars back. For example, if federal officials become enamored with the buzzword empowerment, then I'll guarantee you we're going to come up with funding proposals and we'll call them something like empowerment zones. What we're really doing is begging. We're begging, please give us some of our money back. We're just begging. We're on our hands and knees begging, but we're going to call it empowerment. Begging is now called empowerment. And I would like to ask, does anyone who hasn't been inhaling, does anyone really believe that changing the name of urban renewal is going to change 30 years of failure into a big success? I don't think anyone believes that. But I'm not against empowerment zones. That's getting some of our money back. I might vote against the politician who said, I'm not going to do it, because then somebody else is going to be wasting the money, and I'd rather waste it right here in Georgia. So the spending programs, they don't have to make any sense. By making sense, that is, they don't have to be worth as much as they cost, because we're going to pay for them anyway. The only question is whether the money comes back to our state or goes to another state. Now, just as an aside here, let me talk about unfunded mandates. I think this move we had of restricting unfunded mandates was a move in the right direction. I applauded that aspect of the Contract of America as I did other aspects of the Contract of America. But we have to keep in mind that that's just the first step. What we want to do is not get funded mandates. We want to eliminate the mandates, at least a whole lot of them. Let me tell you a story about one of the mandates. Maybe some of you have heard this story, but it's an interesting one. I've been to Alaska quite a few times. It's a wonderful place to go and visit, particularly in the summer. But Alaska and the city of Anchorage, they have very clean water, very clean water. I mean, it's about as pure as you're going to get. It comes from a glacier, I think. But the EPA, the federal government, has a mandate, and that is that every municipality has to remove 70% of the particulate matter from the water that they used in waste treatment plants. Well, removing 70% of almost nothing is very difficult. The city of Anchorage is going to have to spend literally millions and millions and millions of dollars to build a special facility to remove 70% of almost nothing. So they went to the federal government and said, this doesn't make any sense. Let's not do it. And the federal government, the EPA, said, we're sorry, that's the mandate. It applies across the board. Everybody has to obey the rules. Well, fortunately, in this case, what the city of Anchorage did is they got clever, and they hired some fishermen to pour a bunch of fish guts in the water, and then they took 70% of it out. They probably took more than 70% out. I'd hope they did. But everybody was happy. Anchorage didn't have to build a facility. The EPA, they said, yeah, that's fine. You guys satisfied the requirement. The water's dirtier, but we don't care. We're enforcing the rules. The point is, we want to eliminate some of these mandates. Making the federal government pay for them will help restrain that process, but having the federal government take our money and then mandate a bunch of things that don't make any sense and then giving our money back to pay for it, well, that doesn't make any sense. So that's just a problem, illustrative problem of what we have with this relationship between the federal government and the states. Now, you might think that the availability of all this federal money from federal taxes goes to Washington, comes back. Well, you might think that that lowers state and local taxes. Well, we get this money. We don't have to raise as much money here in the state of Georgia. We paid it to Washington. They give it back to us. It's not clear. It's not clear that it lowers the taxes we pay right here to the state. First of all, it cost a lot of money to beg to get our money back. the state government is full of agencies that are designed to go to Washington and ask for our money back. Now, I play a game with my students. I don't keep the money. I don't give the wrong impression here, but this is a very fun game. It points out the problem in a very vivid way to my students. I'll say I've got $100 here. I've got, say, 30 students. I want each one of you to bid on this $100 bill. Now, if you bid and you're the high bidder, you get it back. You get the federal funding. But if you don't get the high bid, you lose your money. You know, you can't send all these people to Washington, and if they don't get the money, you don't pay them. You don't fund the agency that's up there trying to get our money back. So you bid on this $100 bill. If you don't win, you just lose your money. Well, invariably, people bid, the class will bid far more than the $100. You got to raise a lot of money out there at the state level to compete for that $100, that money back. Well, see, I'm treating my class, I don't keep their money, I give it back to them. But even if I kept the money, I'd be treating my class better than the federal government treats us, because I didn't steal, well, I don't say steal, but I didn't take the $100 from the class in the first place. I didn't take the $100 and then make them bid for it. Also, when these lobbying efforts are successful, even when we get some of our money back, the federal money captured commonly comes with requirements that the state picks up a lot of the tab. And we'll do it because even though the project generally is not worth what it's costing, we'll pay part of it because it might be worth what we're paying, our share of it. The federal share we consider free because that money's gone anyway. And of course, the federal money always comes with red tape that requires state bureaucracies to be bigger and more expensive than they otherwise would. It's not much of an exaggeration to describe this as a situation where we're all paying tribute to Washington for the privilege of stealing from each other. Now, another way of looking at the existing tax arrangements or fiscal arrangements between the states and the federal government is to see it as just a big tax cartel. It's a big cartel. Now, you might not believe this, but it's true. In this country, until the 1930s, most of the taxes were paid at the state and local level. By far, most of the taxes were paid at the state and local level. The federal government got a very small share. In the 1900s, 1910s, the federal government was about 2%, 2-3% of the total GNP. Now it's 24, 25%. Most of the money was paid at the federal and state, at the state and local level. Well, there was a lot of tax competition. A lot of tax competition between the states, and also competition in terms of the quality of the services provided and the efficiency with which those services provided, because people could punish high tax, low service states by just moving, by voting with their feet, just like customers do. They could take their business elsewhere. They could take their tax base elsewhere. Now, that didn't mean that every individual say, well, I got a high property tax bill this year, I don't like it, I'm going to move to Alabama, or I'm going to move to Utah. Everybody didn't have to move, but there's always people thinking about new locations, taking a new job, moving somewhere, retiring, relocating their business. And those people looked at the state and local tax rates and services and made decisions accordingly, and the states couldn't ignore those marginal people because there were a lot of them in the process of moving, and use that as an important factor in where they took their business. So you had a lot of tax competition. That imposed fiscal discipline. Well, beginning in the 30s, the federal government began usurping more and more of the taxing authority. That reduced the tax competition that existed in the country, because then it didn't make much difference whether you're in Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi or New York or Utah or California or Washington. You're going to pay that federal tax anyway. That was getting a bigger and bigger share of the total tax burden. You couldn't escape that short of leaving the country. It was much more difficult to get away, not buy this product, if you will, not patronize that tax authority. And so tax rates were increasingly set monopolistically, if you will, at the federal level rather than competitively at the state and local level. And as you might expect, when the federal government kind of took control monopolistically, started monopolistic pricing, if you will, the tax burden went up, and it went up dramatically. Now, I would argue that if the Department of Justice were really serious about enforcing antitrust laws against cartel arrangements that harm the economy by reducing competition, they'd forget about Microsoft, and they would go after the Internal Revenue Service. They would bust up the Internal Revenue Service. I would say, Janet Reno, break up the IRS. And actually, there's a way of doing that. I'll talk briefly. It's a bold and exciting concept. It doesn't have a chance, but I will talk about that in a little bit. Now, there's a lot of discussion lately of devolution. I think I'm saying that word right. Devolution, devolution, you know what I'm talking about. Shifting functions back to the state and local levels. Well, I haven't made a prediction yet. I've been asked to make a prediction. Let me make one. I'll make a couple of predictions. One prediction I'll make is that nothing is going to come of that. Nothing is going to come of devolution, of shifting responsibilities back to the state level, unless we really shift responsibility back to the state level and the local level, and that's shifting the authority, the responsibility to tax. More and more, the responsibility to tax has to be taken away from Washington and shifted back to the state and local level. Because as long as the tax authority, the primary tax authority in this country, is in the hands of the federal government, we will never have anything more than the pretense of authority at the state and local levels. And we will never have a sensible tax policy as long as the power to tax resides primarily in Washington. And let me give an example of that. There's been a lot of discussion of the flat rate tax. We heard it recommended today. Dick Armey, he recommends it. McMillan recommended it. Lamar Alexander recommended it. Arlen Specter recommends it. Republican candidates for president. I'm a Graham man myself. Actually, I don't know what Graham said about the flat rate tax. He's probably for it too. I'll have to tell him about why he's wrong on that. I think he's wrong, and let me explain why. Now, economists, and I'm an economist, economists have always said, for a long time anyway, that the flat rate is the best tax because it's less distorting. You lower the rate. Those high marginal rates are strong disincentives for productive activity. You lower those marginal rates, get them low. You close the loopholes. That way people can't decide, make economic decisions on the basis of where they can get the biggest tax break, and they'll start making those economic decisions on where they produce the most wealth. That's the advantage of the flat rate tax. I like that. I like that. It reduces the distortion in the economy. At least it reduces some distortion in the economy. For every dollar the federal government raises, a flat rate tax will have less distortion than the tax structure, multi-rate, lots of loopholes. But there's a problem. There's a problem. The flat rate tax with closing the loopholes makes it easier for government to get more of our money. And that's another distortion. And that's a bigger distortion, I think worse than the one that we eliminate with the flat rate tax. Because what it results in is it becomes a money machine for the government. The value-added tax would be the same thing. The federal government would be able to just transfer for more and more money out of the private sector, shift it into the public sector, taking wealth out of the sector that makes the pie bigger and transferring wealth into the sector that just creates a big common pool that otherwise productive people fight over. Otherwise, productive people become involved in fighting over existing wealth rather than producing new wealth. So I would say we don't want the federal government to have a flat rate tax. I would argue we need to flatten the power of the federal government to tax, not give it a flat rate tax. Now, I would also argue I still like a flat rate tax, but we want it at the local level, like the state of Georgia has a flat rate tax. And that makes sense at the local level, because at the local level, you eliminate the distortions I was talking about, but tax competition keeps the governments, the state governments, from using that flat rate tax with no loopholes as a money machine to just grow and grow and grow at the expense of the private sector. Tax competition would prevent the state governments from abusing a flat rate tax. Well, let me conclude by making another forecast. I've been asked to talk about the road ahead, so I'll do that just very briefly. I'm about through. I would forecast that tinkering with the state tax structure ultimately won't make much difference. Not as long as most of the taxing authority resides in Washington, not as long as most of our tax dollars go to Washington. I think what we should be doing is working on some really bold proposals, some really innovative proposals, proposals that will be dismissed as impractical and as impossible dreams and not having a chance, because those are the proposals that might down the road have a chance. And I've got a piece coming out in the Cato Journal, and you people have it within your power. In this room, you have it within your power to double the readership of that article. So I encourage you to do that. But I have a piece coming out in the Cato Journal where I recommend, I'm actually serious about this, that we, as an ideal, eliminate the power to tax by the federal government entirely. The federal government has no power to tax. All the power to tax resides in the state and local level. That's the Articles of Confederation. But there's a problem with the Articles of Confederation. The states didn't give the federal government anything unless they were being invaded by the British. My proposal would have the states have to pass along, say, 40% of every dollar they raised to the federal government for federal functions. The federal government has important functions to play. There's all kinds of advantages of this that I'm not going to go through because it would take too long, but one big advantage is the following. The federal government has a lot of important functions to play. One is national defense, obviously. The federal government does not have an important function fixing potholes in Peoria or fixing potholes in Atlanta or fixing, preparing bike trails, or there's a whole host of silly things they do that if they're worth doing, the states would do them. Under my proposal, the federal government wouldn't do those things. They wouldn't be taking our money because they couldn't get it unless we gave it to them. And what money they did get, they wouldn't send it back to fix potholes or to create empowerment zones. And you know why? Because if they did things that the states would otherwise do themselves, the states would have to raise less revenue, which means that the federal government would get less revenue because this federal government gets no revenue unless the states decide that they want to raise it themselves. There's all kinds of other advantages instead of harnessing the special interest, tying their hands behind them, depowering the special interest. Privatization, we're talking about privatization. I guarantee you this proposal would find the state governments privatizing like crazy, because the payoff would be in efficiency, not inefficiency. Well, that's the impossible dream. We can't move to that right now, but there are things we can do, like term limits. Get some Congress people in Washington who haven't been there long enough to actually believe that Western civilization depends on their spending. And that happens. There's been studies on that. Bring them back. Balanced budget amendment. That's something we could do. We got to start hamstringing or tying the hands of the federal government. And if we don't do that, much of this discussion of what we should do at the state and local level simply is going to be wasted effort. I'm not against it, but it's just not going to be as successful as it could be and would be if we had real authority at the state and local level. Thank you very much.